Hi, I'm Michael Gross, host of the B&O Railroad Museum television network. Trains are a fundamental part of American heritage, and with trains come another fundamental element of American history: U.S. presidents who traveled by rail. On June 6, 1833, Andrew Jackson became the first American president to ride a railroad. William Henry Harrison becomes the first American president-elect to travel the B&O to his inauguration. Several years later, the first presidential speech was carried by train to New York. Prior to that, messages had to be sent by carrier. Just 2 years later marked the first time a presidential message was carried by train to a newspaper. The B&O actually handled both Lincoln's inaugural trip in 1861 and his funeral train from Washington to Baltimore in 1865. In just a few short years, the way people and goods traveled had drastically changed. From 1831 to 1872, the B&O was the only railroad that went into Washington, D.C. The Pennsylvania Railroad ended the monopoly, and others followed up to the 20th century. Taft, Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower all rode the B&O, along with many foreign heads of state and royalty visiting the nation's capital. In 1927, the B&O Railroad's 100th anniversary year, the B&O ordered 20 Pacific-type locomotives from Baldwin Locomotive Works, each to be named after U.S. presidents. Unlike most functional locomotives at the time, these uniquely sophisticated engines were painted olive green with gold accents and honored the nation by displaying the names of the first presidents of the United States. These 20 President-class P7 locomotives were the most well-known of all the B&O Pacifics. The President class of locomotives pulled high-speed royal blue passenger trains between Washington, D.C. and Jersey City. By the 1930s, the railroad introduced modern diesel-electric locomotives to its busiest passenger trains. Most of the President class locomotives were demoted to Western divisions until their retirement in 1956. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a frequent passenger on the B&O's Royal Blue Line during his time in office during 1933 to 1945, when he traveled between Washington and his family home in Hyde Park, New York.
They were quite attractive locomotive, and it wasn't unusual when these locomotives operated into like Washington Terminal or Jersey City, where several railroads came in. Now this is back in the days of steam, that you would have engine men from other railroads tell you, the B&O man, what a beautiful locomotive a P7 was. I wish we had some like this. And the men that worked on them were all very proud of them. And you know, it's a little mystique here, but what's this president's name? How does that play into the picture that you're working on a locomotive carrying a president's name? And it's a little hard to describe, but I'll give you a quote from Cecil B. DeMille, a pre-World War II movie producer. One time he had a movie where the leading actress walked through a room and threw a $200 dress on a chair and kept on going. That was the extent of the $200 dress's part in the movie. He was questioned about this. Why not a $5 dress? And his answer was that he never saw an actor or an actress who did not perform their best around good props. Well, that name up there certainly is a tremendous prop for the men who worked on these locomotives, and they were very proud of them.
On January 15th, 1910, who was elected to become the 14th president of the B&O Railroad?
Until we can move a ton of goods using no fuel, we've got the next best thing. CSX trains can move a ton of goods 436 miles on 1 gallon of fuel. CSX, how tomorrow moves.
On January 15, 1910, Daniel Willard was elected the 14th president of the B&O Railroad. 22 years later, in January, he would be featured on the cover of Time magazine.
Well, you know, the steam locomotive steam drives a piston back and forth in this cylinder, and as it's going back and forth, that's called reciprocating motion. The piston rod is connected to this crosshead, which in turn is connected to the main rod, and at this point we turn the reciprocating motion into rotary motion, and we have movement of the locomotive and train. The flow of steam from the boiler to the cylinder comes down and is controlled by a valve up here. Now, the interesting thing about the steam locomotive is, unlike an internal combustion engine where the valve works on a camshaft, in this situation, a steam locomotive, the engineer controls how far this valve moves rather than a camshaft. So he makes that determination. And how does, of course, he know how to have it set properly? Well, interesting thing, he listens to the stack. Now, the smokestack, when this piston goes back and forth, the exhaust steam goes up through the smokestack, and that's where we hear that wonderful sound of a steam locomotive, chug, chug, chug. And the engineer, with experience, can listen to that chug, chug, chug and determine how far he wants the valve to move. So that's one of the unique things about running a steam locomotive.
This is Michael Gross. Thanks for watching the B&O Railroad Museum Television Network.